welcome to another Car Chats with Herbie. And I thought tonight I would speak about why do engines sound the way they do. Now let's cover the basics. Let's start with a one-cylinder 4-stroke engine, petrol injection, fuel injection. Now shut up, parking sensors, that don't work. Now you have intake stroke. As the cylinder goes down, the cylinder gets filled with air because it acts as a vacuum, sucking air down into it, and then it goes through a compression phase where the air and fuel mixture is mixed together. That's compressed, and it gets hot as well. And then it goes through an ignition phase, and then it goes through an exhaust phase. As the cylinder pulls down, the exhaust valves open and the spent gases are released. Now, by the way, exhaust valves are usually coated in a certain like ceramic style coating because they have to deal with more heat in the intake valves. And also exhaust valves are usually a little bit smaller than intake valves because an engine finds it easier to exhaust and push away spent gases compared to sucking and pulling in. So we tend to have larger intake valves in engines, modern engines, 4-stroke engines. Now the sound of engines is to do with usually the firing order, the firing of the ignition. So what this means is that every time a engine exhaust pushes out spent gases, it has a pulse, a frequency. So a single cylinder engine, like a 125 motorcycle, will have duh, 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 duh. A twin cylinder, depending on the crank throws as well, depending if it's a flat plane or a cross plane crankshaft, firing every 90 degrees or every 180 degrees or 270 degrees in some V-twins as well. Now that has more of a rhythm of duh, 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 duh. And what this means is the frequencies that travel to our ears are uneven. So a Formula 1 car, that has a very even firing sequence. And what this means is, oh, it's going down there. What this means is that the sound traveling to our ears comes in frequent, even pulses to our ears. And it's travelled in an even direction, an even manner. Okay, very linear sound travel. Now, engines like an American cross-plane crank V8. By the way, cross-plane cranks go back to Cadillac invention. Cadillac and Peerless in 1915 came up with the idea of a new style of crankshaft that fires unevenly every 90 degrees. So there's an ignition every 90 degrees, meaning that there's 720 degrees of crankshaft rotation required for all 8 cylinders to fire. Now, they didn't actually quite get the technology right until 1923 for Cadillac, and Peerless was 1924. Now, that way of firing an engine every 90 degrees means that there's uneven exit of exhaust gases, exhaust pulses. So, and this also exhaust shapes, manifold shapes have a lot to do with this. So if you have every 90 degrees firing on a V8 engine on a cross-plane crankshaft, and also cross-plane crankshafts balance out primary forces, which are like torsional forces directed on the axes, directed on the crankshaft, but they don't balance out secondary forces as well. These forces are like vibratory forces that run up to the top of the cylinder, to the top half of the engine, and it acts as a rocking motion. And this pulling rocking motion requires counterweights, balance shafts, or harmonic balances placed on the crank pulley to even these forces out. Now, if you want to know a fact about a balance shaft, Frederick Lancaster was credited for inventing and patenting, it's a funny word, isn't it? The harmonic balance in 1907. Now what this does is the vibrational frequencies that are uneven on an engine, let's say on a cross plane crank or a flat plane crank, these balance shafts are placed next to the crankshaft, or they can be placed higher up on some form of eccentric camshaft or chain, and they vibrate out. Their frequencies are higher than the frequencies and vibrations of the engine's crankshaft and what the piston's creating. So they vibrate and they harmonize the frequencies by having higher frequencies than the frequencies produced by the engine, if that makes somewhat sense to anyone about balancing engines. One goes clockwise, one goes anti-clockwise. This is balancing out these secondary motion forces. Now let's say we have a engine that is 6 cylinders, like a V6, every 60 degrees. What we've got going on here now, an engine that fires every 60 degrees, like a V6 engine, this style of engine requires the necessity for counterweights and balance shafts due to the shorter crankshaft length compared to, let's say, a V8 and things like that, and the web of the crankshaft being heavier and larger, meaning that the piston throw, it can be slightly unbalanced because the weight is quite heavy at the bottom. Now we have to remember that rocking forces as well can be accentuated because a piston moves faster at the top of an engine stroke than it does at the bottom. It slows down at the bottom, and this motion of differences in speed creates a sort of sideways rocking motion within a cylinder, and that can cause bore scoring in severe cases. So there's a necessity, let's say, for a balance shaft. This is likely to happen on an engine with a long stroke, long connecting rod. Let's say diesels. Diesels necessitate a vibrational damper and counterweights between the journals and between the crank pins, because of the torque forces and the torsional forces pulling the fixed axis, the crankshaft, in and out of orientation. Okay, now let's get back to exhaust pulses. Now these pulses are like pockets of air that expand and contract. They exit at a certain rate and a certain speed. It's like a snail crawling along and then moving its body in that sort of rocking motion. Now this also, because of the scavenging effect, not only 2-stroke, I mean 4-stroke as well, because scavenging effect happens with most all auto cycle engines really. Now depending on the orientation of the exhaust pipes, let's say it has uneven scavenging like a Subaru, so the firing order, yes, it's a little strange. It can be left, right, so left on the right hand side, left, right, yep, and back, left, back, right, left, so front, left, and this acts as quite like a pulling orientation, so another form of like rocking motion. And but generally V-twins and engines like that, every 180 degrees, horizontal engines generally balance the forces of the opposing piston out, so they generally pull out primary forces, but not necessarily secondary motional forces. Now, to make a Subaru not sound like a burble box, like some gruttle singer, you can instead have equal length headers. So the pulling of the exhaust gases, spent gases out of the cylinders is evenly scavenged, is evenly extracted. So instead of having, let's say, you're having so it's making the engine, which naturally sounds uneven because of its exhaust orientation, the exhaust exit orientation, the exhaust manifold pipes. By evening these out in length, creating equilibrium between the cylinders, we can create a harmonized frequency, a harmonized sound and pulsation. Now, if you're wondering why American V8s sound very burbly, this is because of the cross-plane crankshaft having very strange firing intervals. You can also get like 72-degree intervals. You can get very odd intervals as well, like 90, 180, 270, 90, 180, 270, which creates a very, very strange frequency travel. And a lot of the burble to do with the pipe diameter. So a larger pipe diameter, let's say having like a drain pipe, very large diameter, let's say, it allows low frequency, low tone sound waves to travel going to your ear. Now you can change that to different diameter pipes, and these different diameter pipes can affect the frequency pitch coming to our ears. And also, it can be muffled and affected by turbocharging and other factors such as that, where air pressure generally is more than the explosion sort of sounds of frequencies, the pinging, the resonance with the exhaust, the sound bouncing around. And let's touch a little bit on valves as well. Did you know that engine valves generally are welded from two pieces? And if you have an aluminium engine, because of thermal expansion, you have to have a collar for the valve head, let's say, the valve fascia at the top, the curvature bit, to sit in, because the thermal expansion of aluminium, contracting, expanding, means that it would create an unsealed chamber. And the difference between steel or iron engines is that they generally don't need these little valve seats because they're more thermally less thermally reactive. And mixed match metals, it really depends. And another thing as well is that pumping losses in engines. So something that you might not know is that some engines have lower pumping losses and higher pumping losses. This is energy lost through the engine having to exert energy, like someone having to run at the same speed, to exert energy to suck in and push away the gases, spent gases, and compress them and things like this. And this is called pumping losses. This is energy taken away from the crankshaft. Now, a crankshaft is a form of directing the power, so of a reciprocal engine, into rotational power and torque through a fixed axis, fixed point, to a driven piece. And we'll probably go into more depth about this in another video and things like that, because I am quite tired today, just being on a long walk, got my feet absolutely soaked, having to wade through some broken manhole cover or something. So yeah, that's a very, very basic explanation style video on why we hear the sounds and frequencies that we do. And I'll end it with one fun fact. The reason why a lot of dragster engines do not have dual overhead cam systems is because it would affect the volumetric size and the ability for the cylinder to compress and create more of a area of compression. So the cylinder have to have more compression because there'll be more space devoided to just the valves, and so you have more cylinder volume if you have less skimming, less fascia taken away from the cylinder head. So that's another interesting fact. Maybe one more little thing is that camshafts, let's say we have a camming gear style engine running on eccentric camshaft. We have the crankshaft gear here driving the crankshaft. Let's say it has 40 teeth, and we have a reduction gear which has 10 teeth. So the reduction gear has to turn 4 times for one full rotation of the 40 teeth, one full rotation of the crankshaft. So that's how we keep the eccentric camshaft in time, in working order. And then we have our eccentric camshaft, our tappet, our push rod, our rocker arm act as a fulcrum. So the longer distance, goes back to Archimedes, is that how this works is that the push rod, little lobe pushes a tappet, rod goes up, right, and it rocks down, depressing the valve, open and close. Now there's a lot more distance between the driven gear and the operation of the valve in comparison to a single overhead or an overhead camshaft engine, meaning that these engines tend to be more lethargic and don't rev quite as high, and don't rev quite as freely because of the time and distance between the driven orientation, so the orientation of the driven gear, and the action at the top. There's a lot longer, takes a lot longer for each cycle to happen. And a fulcrum, basically, let's say I have my finger here. If I push the same amount of force here with my finger this long, it will double, triple the force on this point that I applied here. But if I shorten that, let's say we cut it in half, I would have to apply more force on this point to equate to the same force as having a longer point with the same force applied as a shorter point. And that's a fulcrum, basics of science and things like that, and physics. Now, any news on the old car? Not particularly. It fixed itself the other day. It had a blown bulb. I replaced a bulb that was supposedly blown, and it then didn't fix it, and then I put the old one back in, and then it fixed itself again. Now I think it was a voltage surge, because I depressed the brakes quite hard, and I must have given the vehicle a high amount of circuitry voltage to the brake bulb light at the back, and it must have overcharged it and blown it. And another weird fact is that you're not supposed to use a jump start leads from another car to another car from vehicles after the year 2001 or something like that. This is due to all the componentries that are 5 amps, 12 amps, reference signal componentries, buttons, touch, things like that. And you can fry these computers and all sorts like this. So you're not supposed to do that. But anyway, yeah. Another one is that I think on the next video, because we're going to have to end this video now because I'm going on an ADHD ramble. I've got a few things to do. Is we'll touch on how engines start, maybe a bit more in depth about internals on engines, why, the science behind it, things like that. And maybe we'll try and do a daylight video, because I try to fit these videos